At 34 years old, I noticed a tiny red light blinking in the corner of my bathroom mirror, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. And when I confronted my father about it, he calmly admitted he had installed cameras to monitor my oral hygiene because I'd had cavities as a child 25 years ago. The words hit me like ice water. Cameras, plural, recording me in the most private space of my home, capturing moments I thought were mine alone, all justified by childhood dental problems that had been resolved decades before I even graduated high school. When I demanded to see the footage, when I asked him what exactly he had been watching all these months, his face went pale, and he said something that made my blood run cold, something that revealed this wasn't about teeth at all, but about a father who had never learned where his daughter's body ended and his control began. That night, standing in my bathroom staring at that blinking red light, I realized I had been living in my own personal surveillance state, where even my toothbrush routine was being archived and analyzed by the man who was supposed to protect my privacy, not violate it. My name is Rebecca, and this is the story of how a tiny red light revealed the difference between love and obsession, between caring and spying, and how sometimes the people who claim to protect us are the ones we most need protection from. Before I tell you what my father said when I demanded to see those recordings, and how that moment changed everything I thought I knew about family boundaries, subscribe and share this with someone who understands what it's like to discover your privacy was never really yours. Comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with daughters who've had to learn the hard way that love should never require surveillance. What he said next will make you question everything about control disguised as care. That Tuesday morning began with the mundane ritual of adulthood, stumbling toward my bathroom in yesterday's oversized t-shirt, hair resembling something that belonged in a nature documentary about abandoned bird nests, when I caught sight of something that shouldn't exist in the familiar landscape of my morning routine. A pinprick of crimson light, no bigger than a pinhead, pulsed steadily from the ornate corner of my antique bathroom mirror, the one I'd inherited from my grandmother and hung with such pride 3 years ago when I'd moved back into my childhood home after my divorce fell apart spectacularly. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a reflection from my phone charger, or perhaps some optical illusion created by the morning sun filtering through the frosted window, because the alternative was too disturbing to consider, too violation-heavy to process before I'd even had my first cup of coffee. But as I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass surface, I could see the geometric precision of this anomaly, the way it was embedded within the mirror's decorative frame with surgical accuracy, positioned at exactly the right angle to capture the sink area where I perform my daily ablutions. The discovery process felt like archaeological excavation in reverse. Instead of uncovering ancient history, I was unearthing modern betrayal, running my fingertips along the mirror's edges until I found the barely perceptible outline of a lens housing, so skillfully concealed that only someone specifically searching would ever notice its presence. My stomach dropped into my shoes as the implications cascaded through my consciousness like dominoes falling in slow motion. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't some security system malfunction. This was deliberate surveillance installed by someone with intimate access to my living space, someone who knew my routines well enough to position this digital eye for maximum coverage of my most vulnerable moments. The bathroom suddenly felt smaller, the walls seeming to press inward as I realized that every morning for who knows how long, I had been unknowingly performing for an invisible audience, brushing my teeth and washing my face while being recorded by technology one hadn't consented to, hadn't even known existed. The mirror that had once reflected back my grandmother's memory now reflected back my own naive trust, shattered into 1,000 paranoid fragments as I began questioning every other fixture, every other seemingly innocent household item that might be harboring additional electronic eyes. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over my father's contact information, while my mind raced through possible explanations that didn't involve the unthinkable truth that was crystallizing in my chest like ice forming on a windshield. Maybe there had been break-ins in the neighborhood. Maybe this was some misguided attempt at home security that he'd forgotten to mention. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation that wouldn't require me to confront the fact that my personal sanctuary had been transformed into a viewing platform without my knowledge or permission. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered with that cheerful tone he reserved for unexpected calls from his daughter, completely oblivious to the earthquake about to shatter the foundation of our relationship. Rebecca! What's up, sweetheart? Everything okay? The casual warmth in his voice made my throat constrict as I struggled to form words that would accurately convey the magnitude of my discovery without dissolving into hysterical accusations or paranoid ramblings. Dad, I managed, my voice sounding foreign and strained even to my own ears. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there a camera in my bathroom? The silence that followed stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the sound of his breathing and what sounded like papers rustling in the background, before he finally responded with words that confirmed my worst fears and simultaneously introduced me to a new level of violation I hadn't known existed. I installed cameras to monitor your oral hygiene, he said with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss weekend weather, because you had cavities as a child. The casual delivery of this bombshell made my knees buckle as I gripped the bathroom counter, staring at my reflection in the mirror that was no longer just reflecting but recording, archiving, storing every moment of vulnerability for review by a man who apparently believed that childhood dental issues from the Clinton administration justified turning his adult daughter's bathroom into a surveillance facility in the age of smartphones and privacy laws. The phone call ended with my father's matter-of-fact admission hanging in the air like toxic smoke, and as I sat on my bathroom floor clutching my knees to my chest, I was transported back to being 7 years old again, standing in this very same bathroom with tears streaming down my cheeks after Dr. Martinez had discovered 3 tiny cavities during my routine checkup, watching my father's face transform from proud parent to disappointed disciplinarian as he explained that this was what happened when little girls didn't take proper care of their teeth. I had spent the rest of that week brushing obsessively, morning and night, and sometimes after lunch, desperate to prove that I could be the daughter he wanted, the one who followed rules and maintained standards and never gave him reason to worry or feel ashamed when other parents asked about his children's achievements. That pattern of desperate approval-seeking had woven itself through every milestone of my childhood like golden thread through expensive fabric. The way I'd practice piano until my fingers cramped because he'd mentioned once that musical children were more successful, how I'd chosen my college major based on his offhand comment that business degrees open more doors, the way I'd even selected my wedding dress according to his preference for classic elegance over the bohemian style that had made my heart sing in the boutique mirror. Even my marriage had been unconsciously shaped by his expectations, choosing David partly because my father had immediately approved of his corporate job and financial stability, his clean-cut appearance and golf handicap, and the way he shook hands with firm confidence and made eye contact during conversations about market trends and retirement planning. Every decision, every choice, every fork in the road of my adult life had been navigated with an internal compass that pointed not toward my own true north, but toward whatever would earn that rare smile of paternal pride, that golden moment when he would introduce me to colleagues as my daughter Rebecca, the one I was telling you about. I had been the daughter who never missed curfew, who brought home report cards worthy of refrigerator display, who chose practical shoes over pretty ones and sensible boyfriends over exciting ones, who called every Sunday and remembered every birthday, and always asked about his health and his work and his opinions on everything from investment strategies to home improvement projects. The irony wasn't lost on me now, sitting in the surveilled bathroom, that my lifelong quest to be worthy of his trust had somehow led to a situation where he felt justified in monitoring my dental hygiene like I was still that 7-year-old with cavities, as if 3 decades of responsible adulthood could be erased by childhood imperfections that had been corrected with fluoride treatments and better brushing habits before I'd even reached middle school. I remembered bringing home my college diploma, magna cum laude, and how his first comment hadn't been congratulations, but a gentle suggestion that I should consider graduate school because these days a bachelor's degree is like a high school diploma used to be, always moving the goalposts of achievement just far enough ahead that I could never quite reach the finish line of his complete approval. There had been the promotion at work that earned me a raise and corner office, but his response was to worry that I was working too hard and might neglect my health, the successful dinner party I'd hosted where every dish turned out perfectly, but he'd spent the evening suggesting improvements to my table settings and wine selections, always finding ways to transform my victories into opportunities for enhancement, for growth, for becoming even more deserving of his pride. The worst part was how willingly I'd participated in this dance, how eagerly I'd incorporated his feedback and suggestions into my life choices, treating his opinions like gospel truth rather than recognizing them as the anxious projections of a man who somehow believed that loving his daughter meant maintaining eternal vigilance over every aspect of her existence. From her dental care to her career trajectory to her choice in romantic partners, and apparently, now, her bathroom privacy. 4 years ago, when my marriage to David imploded in a spectacular display of infidelity and financial betrayal that left me emotionally bankrupt and literally homeless, my father had appeared at my apartment door like a knight in shining armor, offering sanctuary in the childhood bedroom I'd vacated over a decade earlier with promises of independence and adult autonomy. The relief I'd felt walking back through that familiar front door with my hastily packed suitcases had been overwhelming, like sinking into warm bathwater after being caught in a freezing rainstorm. Surrounded by the comforting scents of my mother's lavender fabric softener and my father's pipe tobacco that still lingered in the living room despite his having quit smoking 5 years prior. He'd renovated my old bedroom with touching attention to detail, replacing my teenage twin bed with a queen-size mattress and updating the floral wallpaper I'd begged him to change when I was 16, transforming the space into something that felt both nostalgically familiar and respectfully adult, a perfect balance between honoring my past and acknowledging my present circumstances. Those first few weeks had felt like emotional rehabilitation, sleeping soundly for the first time in months while my parents bustled around me with the kind of nurturing care that only comes from people who've loved you since before you could walk, bringing me cups of tea without being asked and cooking my favorite comfort foods and asking nothing more demanding than whether I wanted to watch old movies with them in the evenings. My father had been particularly attentive during those early days, checking in on me multiple times throughout the day with gentle inquiries about my emotional state and practical offers of assistance with everything from job searching to legal paperwork, his protective instincts shifting into overdrive as he witnessed his daughter's confidence slowly rebuilding itself one small victory at a time. But somewhere in the transition from temporary refuge to extended residence, his helpful suggestions began morphing into gentle requirements, his caring observations transforming into detailed monitoring of my daily habits, sleep patterns, eating routines, and social interactions in ways that felt increasingly invasive despite being presented with unwavering love and concern for my well-being. It started innocuously enough, questions about where I was going, and when I'd be back, offered in the tone of someone who simply wanted to know when to expect me for dinner, but gradually escalating into detailed inquiries about who I was seeing, what we discussed, how I felt afterward, and whether these new relationships were healthy for someone in my fragile emotional state. The bathroom camera, I now realized with sickening clarity, had probably been installed during those first few months when I was too devastated to notice anything beyond my own healing process, when I was so grateful for his protection and support that I wouldn't have questioned any security measures he deemed necessary for my safety and recovery. He'd framed everything as temporary assistance while I got back on my feet, but 30 had become 31. 31 had become 32, and somehow my temporary sanctuary had evolved into a permanent arrangement where my father maintained detailed oversight of my personal habits with the same dedication he'd once applied to monitoring my homework completion and curfew compliance. The brilliant manipulation of it all was how he'd made me complicit in my own surveillance, how he convinced me that accepting his help meant accepting his involvement in every aspect of my daily existence, from my career decisions to my dating choices to apparently my dental hygiene routine, all presented under the banner of loving support rather than the controlling behavior it had clearly become. I'd been so damaged by David's betrayal, so grateful for unconditional love after experiencing the conditional variety, that I'd willingly traded my autonomy for the illusion of safety, never recognizing that my father's version of protection involved treating me like a recovering invalid who couldn't be trusted to brush her teeth properly without electronic supervision. The most insidious part was how comfortable I'd become with this arrangement, how easily I'd slipped back into the patterns of seeking his approval and following his guidance, as if the 3 decades of independent adult living had been nothing more than an extended experiment that had failed spectacularly, requiring me to return to his careful management of my existence like a patient returning to intensive care after a failed surgery. After discovering the bathroom surveillance system, I found my mother exactly where I'd expected, standing at the kitchen stove stirring her famous beef stew with the same wooden spoon she'd used for 30 years, humming softly to herself while steam rose from the pot like incense in a domestic cathedral, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband had just admitted to filming their adult daughter's most intimate daily routines. When I told her about the hidden cameras, about Dad's casual confession regarding my childhood dental issues somehow justifying decades later privacy violations, she barely looked up from her cooking, simply nodding with the same serene acceptance she displayed throughout my childhood whenever Dad implemented new safety measures or helpful monitoring systems that other families might have questioned but are simply absorbed like gospel truth. "Oh, honey," she said in that gentle, dismissive tone I remembered from countless similar conversations over the years. "Your father just worries about you, especially after everything you've been through with the divorce and having to move back home. He's always been so concerned about health issues ever since your grandfather died of that heart attack. You know how he gets when he thinks someone he loves isn't taking proper care of themselves." The casual way she normalized this behavior while adding carrots to her stew made my skin crawl with the realization that this pattern of enabling had been happening for generations, that my mother had spent decades translating Dad's controlling behavior into the language of love and concern, serving as his unwitting accomplice in a system of surveillance that she'd learned to view as evidence of deep familial devotion rather than the boundary violations they clearly represented. She continued stirring and seasoning while explaining how worried he'd been during my teenage years when I'd sometimes forget to brush my teeth before bed, how he'd installed motion sensors in my childhood bedroom, just to make sure you were sleeping safely, how he'd tracked my car's mileage during high school to ensure you weren't driving too far or too fast, presenting each invasion of privacy as if it were a thoughtful gift rather than a red flag that should have triggered alarm bells in any rational person's mind. The most disturbing part was watching her face as she recounted these stories, the genuine warmth and affection in her eyes as she described what she clearly viewed as examples of exceptional parental dedication, completely blind to the fact that she was describing a pattern of obsessive monitoring that had apparently escalated from checking my teenage driving habits to filming my adult bathroom routine without missing a beat in her narrative of loving concern. I realized with growing horror that my mother had been gaslighting herself for decades, transforming every controlling behavior into evidence of her husband's deep capacity for love, creating elaborate justifications for surveillance systems that would have made other wives pack their bags and call divorce attorneys, but which she'd internalized as proof of being married to a man who cared so deeply about his family that he couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to them on his watch. "Remember when you were dating that boy in college, the one with the motorcycle?" she continued, tasting her stew and adding more pepper. "Your father was so worried about your safety that he hired a private investigator to make sure the young man didn't have a criminal record or drug problems. Isn't that sweet how much he cared about protecting you from potentially dangerous situations?" The fact that she could describe hiring private investigators to research my college boyfriends as sweet rather than psychotic revealed the depth of her psychological conditioning, the way she'd spent decades reframing stalking behavior as romantic devotion and privacy violations as protective parenting, creating a family mythology where Dad's inability to respect boundaries became evidence of his superior love rather than his problematic need for control. I watched her move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, setting the table for 3 as she'd done thousands of times before, completely unaware that she'd been living in her own surveillance state for decades, probably monitored and tracked and observed just as thoroughly as I had been, but so thoroughly indoctrinated into viewing this treatment as normal that she'd become its most enthusiastic defender and primary enabler. The generational pattern was suddenly crystal clear. My grandmother had probably made similar excuses for my grandfather's controlling behaviors, normalizing jealousy as love and possessiveness as protection, passing down this toxic blueprint from mother to daughter like a family heirloom that poisoned every relationship it touched, teaching each new generation of women to interpret masculine surveillance as evidence of being cherished rather than imprisoned. "Besides," she added, ladling stew into bowls with the same maternal care she'd shown throughout my childhood, "it's not like he's watching you shower or anything inappropriate. It's just dental hygiene monitoring, which is really quite practical when you think about it, especially considering how expensive dental work has become these days and how important preventive care is for long-term health outcomes." 6 months after moving back home, On what should have been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, my father had presented me with an elegantly wrapped package over breakfast, the kind of thoughtful surprise that would have made any daughter's heart warm with gratitude, complete with expensive silver ribbon and a handwritten card that read, "For my beautiful daughter, because your smile is worth protecting," in his distinctive architect's handwriting that I'd always found so reassuring and authoritative. The smart toothbrush inside was a top-of-the-line model, sleek white plastic with embedded sensors and Bluetooth connectivity, the kind of high-tech dental device that cost more than my monthly car payment and came with an accompanying smartphone app that promised to revolutionize my oral care routine through detailed analytics and personalized feedback. Dad had been unusually animated while explaining all the features, his eyes lighting up with the same enthusiasm he typically reserved for discussing building blueprints or investment portfolios, describing how the device would track brushing duration, pressure sensitivity, coverage patterns, and even send gentle reminders to my phone if I forgot my evening routine, all presented as cutting-edge technology designed to optimize my dental health in ways that traditional brushing simply couldn't match. At the time, I'd been genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness, especially considering how expensive this particular model was and how carefully he'd researched all the features to ensure he was giving me the absolute best available option, interpreting his detailed knowledge of toothbrush technology as evidence of a father who paid attention to his daughter's needs rather than a man who'd been obsessively planning the perfect surveillance device disguised as a health improvement gift. The setup process had been surprisingly complex, requiring multiple app downloads and account creations and permissions that I'd granted without reading the fine print, trusting that my father's guidance through the installation process was motivated by genuine desire to help me navigate new technology rather than his need to gain administrative access to every piece of data the device would collect about my bathroom habits. He'd insisted on helping me configure all the settings, explaining that the app needed to be linked to his phone as well for backup purposes and in case you have technical difficulties, creating what I now understood to be a direct pipeline of information from my mouth to his monitoring system, disguised as tech support and parental assistance. The first few weeks of using the device had felt empowering in that peculiar way that new gadgets can make routine tasks seem more important and scientifically validated, watching the colorful charts and graphs populate on my phone screen with data about my brushing performance, earning digital badges for consistency and technique improvements like some kind of dental care video game designed to gamify basic hygiene into an achievement-based reward system. But looking back now, with the knowledge of hidden bathroom cameras and my mother's casual normalization of surveillance masquerading as care, I could see how perfectly this electronic toothbrush fit into a larger pattern of monitoring that had been escalating steadily since my return to childhood dependency, each new, helpful device or thoughtful gift serving as another data collection point in my father's comprehensive surveillance network. The most insidious aspect was how he'd made me complicit in my own monitoring, how he'd convinced me to enthusiastically participate in my own data collection by framing it as self-improvement rather than external control, transforming my bathroom routine into a performance for invisible audiences who evaluated my compliance with dental care protocols that had somehow become more important than my right to privacy. I remembered how proud he'd seemed when I'd thanked him for the gift, how satisfied he'd looked when I'd shown him the app's progress reports and shared my excitement about improving my brushing technique, never realizing that my gratitude was feeding into his psychological need to manage and monitor every aspect of my existence under the guise of technological enhancement and health optimization. The brilliance of this particular surveillance method was its apparent legitimacy. After all, who could argue with a father wanting to help his daughter maintain better dental hygiene, especially one who'd had childhood cavities that had clearly traumatized him far more deeply than they'd ever affected me, creating a justification framework that made questioning his motives seem ungrateful and paranoid rather than reasonable and appropriate. Now, standing in my surveilled bathroom holding this device that had seemed like such a thoughtful gift 6 months ago, I could see it for what it truly was, a Trojan horse of loving manipulation, a beautifully packaged violation of autonomy that I'd welcomed into my most private spaces with genuine appreciation, never suspecting that my father's generosity came with invisible strings attached that connected directly to his phone, his anxiety, and his pathological need to maintain control over a daughter who'd somehow never been allowed to grow beyond the 7-year-old with cavities who disappointed him 3 decades ago. The toothbrush revelation opened floodgates of suspicion that sent me prowling through my childhood home like a detective investigating my own life, examining every electronic device, every seemingly innocent household gadget, every piece of technology that had been introduced since my return with the kind of forensic attention I should have applied years earlier if I hadn't been so blindly trusting of paternal benevolence. My father's smartphone, which he left unlocked on the kitchen counter while showering, revealed a constellation of applications I'd never heard of but whose purposes became horrifyingly clear as I scrolled through dashboards displaying real-time data about my daily activities, step counters tracking my movements throughout the house, sleep pattern analyzers connected to sensors I was only now realizing must be embedded in my mattress, even a grocery app that recorded every item I'd purchased. At the local supermarket through some kind of loyalty card integration that fed directly into his comprehensive dossier of my consumption habits. The discovery process felt like peeling back layers of wallpaper to reveal rot underneath, each new application revealing additional depths of invasion that had been operating invisibly in the background of my supposedly private life, transforming routine activities into data points in what appeared to be a comprehensive behavioral analysis project disguised as loving paternal concern. The fitness tracker he'd given me for Christmas last year, which I'd worn religiously believing it would help me rebuild my physical health after the emotional devastation of divorce, turned out to be transmitting detailed location data, heart rate information, and sleep quality metrics directly to his phone through family sharing settings that I'd never explicitly agreed to, but which had somehow been activated during the initial setup process when he'd helped me configure the device for optimal performance. Even more disturbing was discovering that my car's navigation system had been linked to his account, creating a comprehensive travel log of every destination I'd visited over the past 3 years, complete with timestamps and duration of stays, essentially providing him with a detailed map of my social life, work schedule, medical appointments, and recreational activities without my knowledge or consent. The home's Wi-Fi network, which he managed with the same obsessive attention to detail he applied to his architectural projects, revealed itself to be a sophisticated data collection system that logged every website I visited, every streaming service I accessed, every social media platform I scrolled through during late-night bouts of insomnia or afternoon procrastination, creating a digital fingerprint of my interests, concerns, entertainment preferences, and even my search history related to dating websites and therapy resources. Smart light bulbs throughout the house turned out to be motion-activated data collectors that recorded when I entered and exited each room, how long I spent in different spaces, what time I typically went to bed and woke up, essentially mapping my domestic routines with the precision of a behavioral researcher studying lab animals in controlled environments. The realization that even my streaming television subscriptions had been configured to send viewing reports to his email address made me question every moment of relaxation I'd enjoyed over the past 3 years, wondering whether my choices in entertainment were being analyzed for psychological insights or concerning patterns that might indicate depression, inappropriate content consumption, or social isolation that required intervention or discussion. The refrigerator's smart features, which had seemed so convenient when he'd upgraded our kitchen appliances shortly after my arrival, were logging every time I opened the door, creating meal timing data that could reveal eating disorders, late-night snacking habits, or irregular schedules that might suggest emotional instability or poor self-care routines requiring paternal guidance and correction. Even the thermostat had been weaponized in service of his comprehensive surveillance system, tracking when I adjusted temperatures and correlating this information with my sleep patterns and daily routines to create what appeared to be a detailed behavioral profile that would make professional stalkers envious of its thoroughness and sophistication. The most chilling discovery was a folder on his laptop labeled Rebecca Health Monitoring that contained spreadsheets with months of compiled data from all these various sources, creating charts and graphs that analyzed my behavior patterns with the kind of obsessive detail typically reserved for medical research or criminal investigations, complete with color-coded categories for different types of activities and statistical analysis of trends that suggested concerning deviations from what he apparently considered normal or healthy behavior for a recovering divorcee. The systematic nature of this data collection revealed a level of premeditation and technological sophistication that far exceeded simple parental worry. suggesting instead a man who had transformed his anxiety about his daughter's well-being into a comprehensive surveillance operation that would have been impressive if it weren't so completely violative of every boundary that should exist between family members who respect each other's autonomy and privacy. That evening, after discovering the full scope of my digital imprisonment, I found myself back in the bathroom where this nightmare had begun, sitting cross-legged on the cold ceramic tiles in my oversized pajamas, staring up at the tiny red light that continued blinking with mechanical indifference, while tears streamed down my cheeks in a way I hadn't cried since childhood, the kind of ugly, primal sobbing that comes from somewhere deeper than disappointment or anger and reaches into the core of your identity to question everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. The mirror reflected back a woman who looked exactly like me but felt like a stranger. Same brown hair, same green eyes, same 34-year-old face marked by laugh lines and the subtle signs of stress that come with divorce and career struggles. But underneath that familiar exterior was someone I was only now beginning to recognize as a person who had never truly lived independently, never made a decision without invisible oversight, never experienced the terrifying freedom of being completely alone with her own choices and consequences. The absurdity of my situation hit me in waves as I sat there on my bathroom floor, a grown woman with a master's degree and a successful career and 3 decades of life experience, reduced to tears by the realization that I had been living like a laboratory specimen under constant observation. My most basic human functions cataloged and analyzed by someone who claimed to love me but apparently didn't trust me to brush my teeth properly without electronic supervision and behavioral modification. The red light pulsed steadily above me like a digital heartbeat, and I found myself wondering how many hours of footage existed of me in various states of undress and vulnerability, how many mornings had been recorded as I stumbled sleepily toward the sink, how many evenings had been archived as I washed my face and prepared for bed, completely unaware that my most private rituals were being preserved for posterity by a man who justified this violation through childhood dental problems that had been resolved before I could legally vote. My reflection in the surveilled mirror showed someone who looked pathetic rather than dignified, someone who had somehow allowed herself to be infantilized so gradually and thoroughly that she hadn't even noticed the process happening, like a frog slowly boiling in water that gets warmer so incrementally that the creature never realizes it's being cooked alive until it's too late to jump out of the pot. The weight of 3 years of accumulated surveillance pressed down on me like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe as I contemplated the staggering invasion of privacy I had not only tolerated but actively participated in, thanking my captor for the chains he disguised as gifts, expressing gratitude for the cage he'd constructed around my adult life with such loving attention to detail that I'd mistaken imprisonment for protection. I pressed my palms against the cold tile floor and tried to remember the last time I had made a decision without considering how it would be perceived, analyzed, or recorded by the invisible audience that had apparently been watching my every move, evaluating my choices, and maintaining detailed records of my behavioral patterns like I was some kind of ongoing scientific experiment rather than a human being deserving of basic dignity and autonomy. The smart toothbrush sat in its charging cradle, innocent-looking and expensive, a perfect symbol of how technology could be weaponized in service of love gone wrong, how caring could be twisted into controlling, how protection could become persecution, so gradually that the victim actually helped with her own imprisonment by maintaining the devices and appreciating the thoughtfulness behind each new addition to her surveillance network. My phone, sitting on the bathroom counter, suddenly felt like another surveillance device rather than a communication tool, and I found myself wondering which apps were reporting my emotional state, my sleep patterns, my social interactions back to the man who had somehow convinced himself that loving his daughter meant never allowing her to exist outside his sphere of observation and influence. The question that kept echoing in my mind as I sat there crying on my bathroom floor wasn't whether my father loved me. I knew he did, in his own twisted way, but whether I had ever actually been allowed to grow up, whether the woman staring back at me from that surveilled mirror was really an adult or just a carefully monitored child playing dress-up in grown-up clothes, following scripts written by someone else and calling it independence when it was actually just a more sophisticated form of dependency. The realization that I was 34 years old and had never truly been trusted to take care of myself, had never been allowed to fail or succeed on my own terms, had never experienced the fundamental human right to privacy and autonomy, hit me with such devastating clarity that I couldn't stop the wailing that erupted from somewhere deep in my chest. Mourning not just for the privacy I'd lost, but for the adult woman I'd never been allowed to become. Sitting on that bathroom floor with mascara streaking down my cheeks, I began excavating my memory like an archaeologist uncovering evidence of ancient civilizations, except instead of pottery shards and burial sites, I was discovering a 34-year timeline of manipulation so subtle and pervasive that I'd mistaken it for exceptional parental involvement, each suggestion and recommendation now revealing itself as a carefully orchestrated campaign to ensure that my life unfolded according to his blueprint rather than my own authentic desires and instincts. My choice of college, which I'd always believed was my own decision based on academic merit and career prospects, suddenly looked different when I remembered how he'd strategically scheduled visits to his preferred universities, how he'd happened to have alumni contacts at the business school he favored, how my acceptance letter to the art program that had made my heart sing had mysteriously been lost in the mail, while his top choice arrived with remarkable speed and a handwritten note from the dean, who knew my father's excellent reputation in the architectural community, the major I'd selected, the internships I'd pursued, even the thesis topic I'd researched with such passion. All of it now appeared to be the result of countless micro-influences and strategic conversations where his opinions had been presented as objective advice rather than the psychological manipulation they clearly represented. Each career milestone carefully orchestrated to align with his vision of appropriate professional development for his daughter. My wedding planning, which should have been a celebration of love and personal taste, revealed itself as a masterclass in paternal control disguised as helpful guidance, from the venue he'd discovered, through his professional network to the photographer whose work really captured family values, to the menu selections that reflected classic elegance rather than trendy nonsense that people would regret in photographs. Even my choice of husband began to look suspicious when I remembered how quickly David had earned his approval, how enthusiastically he'd supported our relationship despite my initial reservations about David's emotional availability, how he'd practically orchestrated our engagement by creating opportunities for romantic moments and providing financial incentives that made marriage seem like the logical next step, rather than a decision I'd arrived at through my own emotional journey. The apartment David and I had shared during our brief marriage had been located in a neighborhood my dad had recommended, furnished with items he'd helped us select, decorated according to his suggestions about investment pieces that would last a lifetime, essentially creating a living space that reflected his aesthetic preferences rather than our personal style or financial reality. My career trajectory, which I'd always viewed as evidence of my professional competence and strategic thinking, now appeared to be the result of his extensive networking and behind-the-scenes advocacy, with promotions and opportunities that had seemed like natural recognition of my talents actually stemming from his influence within industry circles where his architectural firm commanded significant respect and reciprocal favors. The friends I'd maintained throughout adulthood were almost exclusively people he'd approved of, their personalities and values aligning perfectly with his preferences for my social circle, while relationships that had felt organic and authentic had somehow faded away after subtle comments about their negative influence or questionable life choices that had gradually poisoned my enthusiasm for spending time with anyone who didn't meet his standards for appropriate companionship. My hobbies and interests, my reading preferences, my vacation destinations, my investment strategies, my healthcare choices, everything that should have constituted my personal identity had been shaped by his gentle guidance and persistent suggestions, creating an adult life that looked like mine from the outside, but was actually a carefully curated exhibition of his values and priorities, displayed through the vehicle of my supposedly independent existence. The divorce that had devastated me and sent me fleeing back to his protective embrace now looked like the inevitable result of choosing a life partner based on his criteria rather than my own emotional needs, marrying someone who satisfied his requirements for financial stability and social respectability rather than someone who understood my dreams, my fears, my authentic self that had been buried so deeply under layers of paternal programming that I'd forgotten it existed. The most chilling realization was recognizing how skillfully he'd made me believe that each of these decisions was entirely my own, how he'd cultivated the illusion of choice while systematically eliminating options that didn't align with his master plan, creating a psychological environment where his preferences felt like natural conclusions I'd reached through careful consideration rather than the result of sophisticated emotional manipulation that had been operating since before I could form independent thoughts. The generational trauma suddenly became visible. His own father had probably exercised similar control, creating a man so terrified of losing influence over his loved ones that he'd built an entire life philosophy around the belief that love meant never allowing the people you cared about to make mistakes, suffer consequences, or experience the messy reality of autonomous decision-making that defines authentic adulthood. 3 months ago, I had finally worked up the courage to download a dating app, carefully crafting a profile that felt authentic and hopeful despite my recent divorce. Selecting photos that showed my genuine smile, and writing a bio that balanced honesty about my current living situation with optimism about finding companionship, and maybe eventually love with someone who could see past my temporary circumstances to the woman I was becoming. The process of swiping through potential matches had felt like a small rebellion against my isolated existence, a tentative step toward reclaiming the romantic autonomy that had been missing from my marriage to David, who had been chosen more for his ability to impress my dad than for his capacity to make my heart race or my mind come alive with possibility and excitement. When I matched with James, a 36-year-old veterinarian with kind eyes and a passion for hiking, our text conversations had flowed with the effortless rhythm that happens when two people discover unexpected compatibility, discussing everything from travel dreams to philosophical questions about animal consciousness to silly debates about the best coffee brewing methods that somehow revealed deeper layers of personality and humor. Our first phone call had lasted 3 hours, stretching late into the night as we shared stories about our respective divorces, our career aspirations, our families, our fears about starting over in our 30s, creating the kind of intimate connection that reminded me why dating could be magical when it wasn't filtered through parental approval or societal expectations about appropriate partnerships. When James suggested meeting for dinner at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown, I had felt genuinely excited for the first time in months, spending an entire afternoon selecting an outfit that made me feel confident and attractive, practicing conversation topics in my car mirror, even buying new lipstick that made me feel like a woman stepping back into her own romantic story rather than a divorced daughter hiding in her childhood bedroom. The evening had started perfectly. James was even more charming in person, with laugh lines that deepened when he smiled and a way of listening that made me feel like the most fascinating person in the restaurant, asking thoughtful questions about my work and my dreams that showed genuine interest in understanding who I was beyond my dating profile statistics and carefully curated photos. We were sharing tiramisu and debating whether to extend the evening with a walk through the nearby park when my phone rang with my father's distinctive ringtone, which I immediately declined, but the interruption broke the romantic spell just enough for me to notice James checking his own phone with a puzzled expression that made my stomach drop with inexplicable dread. "This is weird," he said, showing me his screen where multiple text messages had appeared from an unknown number, messages that made my blood turn to ice as I read threats about inappropriate contact with vulnerable women and warnings about legal consequences for predatory behavior toward recovering divorcees, and detailed accusations about his character that could only have come from someone with access to information about my personal history and current emotional state. The messages continued arriving in real time as we sat there, James's confusion transforming into alarm as more accusations appeared, along with what appeared to be screenshots of his dating profile and personal information that suggested someone had been conducting background research with investigative thoroughness that went far beyond casual concern for a daughter's safety. My father's number appeared on my phone again, and this time I answered with trembling hands, hearing his voice tight with righteous anger as he explained that he'd been monitoring my online activities for security purposes and had discovered my inappropriate relationship with a stranger whose background he'd immediately researched through private investigation services that revealed concerning patterns of behavior with divorced women. The humiliation of having to explain to James that my father had somehow accessed my dating app information, conducted unauthorized background checks, and was now actively sabotaging my romantic life with threatening messages sent from burner phones felt like the final nail in the coffin of my adult dignity. Watching this kind and interesting man's face transform from confusion to concern to the dawning realization that he was dealing with a level of family dysfunction that exceeded his capacity for understanding or tolerance. James left money on the table and excused himself with polite but final language about complicated family situations and needing to prioritize his own peace of mind, effectively ending what could have been the beginning of something beautiful before it even had a chance to develop naturally, leaving me sitting alone in that restaurant with the taste of tiramisu turning bitter in my mouth and the crushing knowledge that my father's protective instincts had just destroyed my first genuine romantic connection in years through surveillance tactics that would have been impressive if they weren't so completely devastating to my prospects for independent adult relationships. The next morning, I found him in his home office reviewing architectural blueprints with the same methodical attention to detail he applied to every aspect of his professional and personal life, surrounded by the familiar scents of coffee and pipe tobacco that had once represented comfort and security but now felt like the aromatic camouflage of a predator's den. And when I demanded answers about the dating app's sabotage, about the hidden cameras, about the comprehensive digital tracking system he'd constructed around my existence, his initial response was the kind of wounded bewilderment that would have made me question my own sanity if I hadn't spent the previous night screenshotting evidence and documenting the scope of his technological invasion. "Rebecca, sweetheart," he said with that gentle tone he perfected over decades of deflecting uncomfortable conversations, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. Everything I've done has been motivated by love and concern for your well-being, especially after the trauma you experienced with David's betrayal left you vulnerable to making poor decisions about men who might take advantage of your emotional fragility and financial instability." The way he framed my legitimate complaints as evidence of psychological disturbance was masterful in its subtlety, suggesting that my anger was actually a symptom of post-divorce emotional instability rather than a rational response to having my privacy systematically violated by someone who claimed to cherish me above all else, effectively turning my justified outrage into proof that I needed exactly the kind of protective oversight I was trying to reject. When I showed him the screenshots of his tracking applications, the evidence of bathroom cameras, the threatening messages sent to James, he examined each piece of documentation with the same professional detachment he might apply to reviewing building code violations, nodding thoughtfully, as if he were a neutral observer rather than the architect of this comprehensive surveillance system that had transformed our family home into a high-tech prison disguised as a sanctuary. "I can see how this might seem excessive from your perspective," he acknowledged with a kind of reasonable tone that made me doubt my own emotional responses. "But you have to understand that modern technology offers us unprecedented opportunities to keep our loved ones safe, and after everything that happened with your marriage, with your sister's accident when she was your age, with your mother's family history of poor judgment in relationships, I simply couldn't stand by and watch you potentially make decisions that could destroy your future happiness." The mention of my sister's car accident, which had occurred 15 years ago and had absolutely nothing to do with dating apps or dental hygiene, revealed the depth of his psychological manipulation. The way he could weave together unrelated traumatic events to create a narrative where his controlling behavior became not just justified but morally imperative, transforming him from perpetrator into protector and me from victim into ungrateful beneficiary of his sacrificial vigilance. His voice took on that familiar quality of martyred patience as he explained how difficult it had been for him to maintain this level of oversight without my appreciation, how much time and energy he'd invested in researching security technologies and background investigation services, how many sleepless nights he'd spent worrying about my safety and emotional stability, essentially reframing his obsessive monitoring as evidence of his superior capacity for love rather than his pathological inability to respect boundaries. "The veterinarian you met," he continued with clinical precision, "has a pattern of targeting recently divorced women, which I discovered through perfectly legal background research that any responsible parent would conduct when their vulnerable daughter starts dating strangers from the internet. Would you prefer that I ignore red flags and allow you to potentially become involved with someone who could hurt you financially or emotionally when you're still recovering from your previous relationship trauma?" The fact that he'd somehow twisted James's compassionate work with animals and his honest disclosure about his own divorce into evidence of predatory behavior revealed the paranoid lens through which he viewed anyone who might offer me independence from his protective umbrella his inability to distinguish between genuine threats and normal human connections that didn't involve his approval or oversight. When I pointed out that a 34-year-old woman should have the right to make her own romantic decisions, even if they turned out to be mistakes, he looked at me with genuine confusion, as if the concept of learning through experience rather than avoiding all potential negative outcomes was fundamentally foreign to his worldview. As if love meant never allowing the people you cared about to encounter the disappointments and discoveries that define authentic adult development. The conversation continued in circles, with every piece of evidence I presented being recontextualized as proof of his devotion, every boundary violation being reframed as security measure, every invasion of privacy being transformed into evidence of his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for my protection, until I began questioning whether I was the one with distorted thinking, whether my desire for autonomy was actually selfishness, whether his comprehensive monitoring was indeed the price of being loved by someone who cared enough to never let anything bad happen to me. That evening, standing once again in my surveilled bathroom with the smart toothbrush clutched in my trembling hands like a weapon I was finally ready to use against my own imprisonment, I realized that this innocent-looking piece of plastic had become the perfect symbol of everything wrong with our relationship: expensive, technologically sophisticated, ostensibly beneficial, but ultimately a tool of dominance disguised as care, a gift that had transformed my most basic human function into a performance for an audience that had never been invited into my personal space. The weight of it felt heavier than its actual physical mass, burdened with the knowledge of every morning and evening it had transmitted data about my dental habits to someone who believed that loving me meant never trusting me to take care of myself, never allowing me the dignity of private bodily functions, never permitting me the fundamental human right to brush my teeth without electronic supervision and behavioral analysis. I could hear him moving around downstairs, probably reviewing the day's surveillance reports from his various tracking applications, checking to see if my location data revealed any concerning patterns, analyzing my sleep metrics for signs of depression or anxiety that might require intervention, treating my emotional state like a research project that demanded constant monitoring and adjustment rather than the natural ebb and flow of a human being processing the complexities of rebuilding her life after devastating betrayal. The red light in the corner of my mirror blinked steadily, that mechanical heartbeat that had been recording my most vulnerable moments for years without my knowledge, and I found myself wondering what the footage looked like from his perspective. Did he fast forward through the boring parts? Did he pause on moments that concerned him? Did he maintain spreadsheets tracking the duration and thoroughness of my dental care routines, like some kind of dental hygiene performance review conducted by a manager who had forgotten that employees should have the right to quit? The absurdity of the situation hit me with fresh waves of rage and humiliation as I stood there holding this symbol of technological paternalism, this monument to the complete erosion of trust between a grown woman and the man who had somehow convinced himself that love meant creating a comprehensive surveillance state within the walls of what should have been a safe harbor, a refuge, a place where healing could happen without documentation and analysis. My reflection in the monitored mirror showed someone who looked exhausted beyond her years, someone whose eyes held the particular kind of weariness that comes from discovering that the person you trusted most in the world had been systematically violating your privacy while convincing you to be grateful for the violation. Someone whose face bore the expression of a prisoner who had just realized that the comfortable cell was still a cell, regardless of how luxuriously appointed or benevolently managed it might be. The decision crystallized in my mind with sudden clarity as I raised the toothbrush above my head, feeling the satisfying weight of rebellion as I brought it down against the marble bathroom counter with enough force to crack its sleek white plastic casing. Watching pieces of expensive technology scatter across the floor like fragments of broken promises and shattered illusions about what constituted appropriate parental love in the 21st century. The sound of destruction was tremendously satisfying, a physical manifestation of my psychological breaking point, and I found myself laughing with a combination of hysteria and liberation as I gathered the pieces and marched downstairs to where he sat in his leather recliner, probably receiving notifications on his phone about the sudden silence from his dental monitoring system, probably already formulating explanations about technical malfunctions and replacement devices that would restore his ability to track my oral hygiene compliance. "I'm done," I announced, dumping the shattered remnants of his surveillance device onto his coffee table with enough force to rattle his whiskey glass and scatter the architectural magazines he'd been pretending to read while actually monitoring my bathroom activities. I'm done being your research subject. I'm done being your patient. I'm done being your project. And I'm done pretending that this is what love looks like when it's actually what obsession looks like dressed up in the costume of paternal concern and technological innovation. The look of genuine surprise on his face revealed how completely he'd convinced himself that his monitoring was not only acceptable but appreciated, how thoroughly he'd internalized the narrative that his surveillance was a service I should be grateful for rather than a violation I should be furious about, how deeply he believed that dismantling his tracking systems was evidence of my psychological instability rather than my psychological health finally asserting itself after years of systematic suppression. The broken toothbrush pieces sat between us like evidence in a trial where the verdict was already clear, where the defendant had been caught in the act but still couldn't understand why the jury was looking at him with horror rather than admiration for his dedication to keeping his daughter safe from herself, and the world that might dare to touch her without his permission or oversight. That evening, standing once again in my surveilled bathroom with the smart toothbrush clutched in my trembling hands like a weapon I was finally ready to use against my own imprisonment, I realized that this innocent-looking piece of plastic had become the perfect symbol of everything wrong with our relationship: expensive, technologically sophisticated, ostensibly beneficial, but ultimately a tool of dominance disguised as care, a gift that had transformed my most basic human function into a performance for an audience that had never been invited into my personal space. The weight of it felt heavier than its actual physical mass, burdened with the knowledge of every morning and evening it had transmitted data about my dental habits to someone who believed that loving me meant never trusting me to take care of myself, never allowing me the dignity of private bodily functions, never permitting me the fundamental human right to brush my teeth without electronic supervision and behavioral analysis. I could hear him moving around downstairs, probably reviewing the day's surveillance reports from his various tracking applications, checking to see if my location data revealed any concerning patterns, analyzing my sleep metrics for signs of depression or anxiety that might require intervention, treating my emotional state like a research project that demanded constant monitoring and adjustment rather than the natural ebb and flow of a human being processing the complexities of rebuilding her life after devastating betrayal. The red light in the corner of my mirror blinked steadily, that mechanical heartbeat that had been recording my most vulnerable moments for years without my knowledge, and I found myself wondering what the footage looked like from his perspective. Did he fast forward through the boring parts? Did he pause on moments that concerned him? Did he maintain spreadsheets tracking the duration and thoroughness of my dental care routines, like some kind of dental hygiene performance review conducted by a manager who had forgotten that employees should have the right to quit? The absurdity of the situation hit me with fresh waves of rage and humiliation as I stood there holding this symbol of technological paternalism, this monument to the complete erosion of trust between a grown woman and the man who had somehow convinced himself that love meant creating a comprehensive surveillance state within the walls of what should have been a safe harbor, a refuge, a place where healing could happen without documentation and analysis. My reflection in the monitored mirror showed someone who looked exhausted beyond her years, someone whose eyes held the particular kind of weariness that comes from discovering that the person you trusted most in the world had been systematically violating your privacy while convincing you to be grateful for the violation. Someone whose face bore the expression of a prisoner who had just realized that the comfortable cell was still a cell, regardless of how luxuriously appointed or benevolently managed it might be. The decision crystallized in my mind with sudden clarity as I raised the toothbrush above my head, feeling the satisfying weight of rebellion as I brought it down against the marble bathroom counter with enough force to crack its sleek white plastic casing. Watching pieces of expensive technology scatter across the floor like fragments of broken promises and shattered illusions about what constituted appropriate parental love in the 21st century. The sound of destruction was tremendously satisfying, a physical manifestation of my psychological breaking point, and I found myself laughing with a combination of hysteria and liberation as I gathered the pieces and marched downstairs to where he sat in his leather recliner, probably receiving notifications on his phone about the sudden silence from his dental monitoring system. probably already formulating explanations about technical malfunctions and replacement devices that would restore his ability to track my oral hygiene compliance. "I'm done," I announced, dumping the shattered remnants of his surveillance device onto his coffee table with enough force to rattle his whiskey glass and scatter the architectural magazines he'd been pretending to read while actually monitoring my bathroom activities. "I'm done being your research subject. I'm done being your patient. I'm done being your project. And I'm done pretending that this is what love looks like when it's actually what obsession looks like dressed up in the costume of paternal concern and technological innovation." The look of genuine surprise on his face revealed how completely he'd convinced himself that his monitoring was not only acceptable but appreciated, how thoroughly he'd internalized the narrative that his surveillance was a service I should be grateful for rather than a violation I should be furious about, how deeply he believed that dismantling his tracking systems was evidence of my psychological instability rather than my psychological health finally asserting itself after years of systematic suppression. The broken toothbrush pieces sat between us like evidence in a trial where the verdict was already clear, where the defendant had been caught in the act but still couldn't understand why the jury was looking at him with horror rather than admiration for his dedication to keeping his daughter safe from herself, and the world that might dare to touch her without his permission or oversight. The silence that followed my toothbrush destruction stretched between us like a chasm filled with 34 years of unspoken truths, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor I hadn't heard since the phone call that had shattered our family 15 years ago. The one that had informed us that my older sister Emma had been found in her apartment 3 days after suffering a fatal allergic reaction to medication she'd been taking without telling anyone because she'd wanted to prove she could manage her anxiety disorder independently, without family interference or medical oversight that felt too much like the childhood monitoring she'd spent years trying to escape. "I can't lose you the way I lost Emma," he whispered, and for the first time in this entire confrontation, his carefully maintained composure cracked open to reveal the raw terror that had been driving his compulsive need to track every aspect of my existence. The paralyzing fear that had transformed a grieving parent into a technological stalker who justified privacy violations through the lens of preventing another family tragedy that might unfold in secret, beyond the reach of his protective influence. The confession hung in the air between us like a ghost materializing in broad daylight, suddenly giving shape and context to years of increasingly invasive behavior that I'd attributed to generic overprotectiveness rather than the specific trauma of discovering that his eldest daughter had died alone, struggling to breathe in an empty apartment while he'd been blissfully unaware that she was in crisis, completely ignorant of the medical risks she'd been managing without family support or professional guidance that might have saved her life. His hands shook as he reached for his whiskey, and I could see the weight of 15 years' worth of accumulated guilt and regret etched into the lines around his eyes. The way his shoulders carried the burden of believing that if he just monitored Emma more closely, if he just insisted on more regular check-ins, if he just implemented some kind of tracking system that could have alerted him to her medical emergency, she might still be alive to roll her eyes at his overprotective tendencies rather than lying buried in Riverside Cemetery under a headstone that bore the words "beloved daughter," but could never capture the complexity of a young woman who died trying to prove her independence. "She stopped returning my calls those last few weeks," he continued, his voice breaking on words that had clearly been rehearsed in therapy sessions and midnight conversations with my mother. And I told myself I was respecting her boundaries, giving her the space she'd asked for since she was 28 and perfectly capable of managing her own life. But she wasn't managing it, Rebecca. She was drowning in anxiety and pride and the stubborn belief that asking for help meant admitting failure. And by the time her landlord called because neighbors were complaining about a smell, it was too late for help, too late for intervention, too late for all the love and support I should have been providing whether she wanted it or not. The parallel he was drawing between Emma's situation and mine was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Heartbreaking because I could finally understand the source of his pathological need to maintain constant awareness of my well-being, and infuriating because he'd apparently learned exactly the wrong lesson from our family tragedy, concluding that the solution to losing one daughter to independence was to ensure that his remaining daughter never achieved true autonomy, never experienced the risks and freedoms that define authentic adulthood, never had the opportunity to make the kinds of mistakes that might theoretically lead to catastrophic consequences. The technological surveillance, the dating app's sabotage, the bathroom cameras, the comprehensive tracking systems, all of it suddenly made a twisted kind of sense when viewed through the lens of a man who'd been living with survivor's guilt for 15 years, who convinced himself that Emma's death could have been prevented if he'd just been more invasive, more persistent, more willing to violate her privacy in service of her safety, more committed to treating his adult children like patients in need of constant medical monitoring rather than human beings deserving of dignity and self-determination. But Emma died because she was ashamed to ask for help with her anxiety, I said, my voice surprisingly gentle despite the anger still coursing through my system. Not because she needed someone to monitor her toothbrushing habits or track her dating life. She needed emotional support and professional treatment, not technological surveillance and behavioral analysis. And what you've done to me wouldn't have saved her because the problem was never about information gathering, it was about creating an environment where your daughters felt safe being vulnerable rather than feeling like they had to perform independence to earn your respect. The truth of my words seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and I watched as 15 years of misguided protective strategies revealed themselves to be monuments to his own trauma rather than effective safeguards against future loss, elaborate coping mechanisms that had transformed his grief into a prison for the daughter who'd survived. 6 months after moving into my own apartment, I invited my parents to visit for the first time since our devastating confrontation, and as they sat awkwardly on my second-hand couch sipping tea from mismatched mugs I'd purchased at a thrift store because they made me smile rather than because they coordinated with any particular decorating scheme, I could see my father's hands trembling slightly as he struggled to resist the urge to comment on my furniture choices, my housekeeping standards, or the obvious gaps in my kitchen equipment that his practical mind wanted desperately to address with helpful suggestions and Amazon shopping links. The conversation felt like learning a new language, with all of us searching for words that could convey love and concern without crossing the carefully negotiated boundaries we'd established through months of painful family therapy sessions where a professional mediator had helped us distinguish between caring and controlling, between support and intrusion, between the kind of parental involvement that nurtures growth and the kind that stunts it through excessive intervention and premature rescue from natural consequences. My father had been attending his own therapy sessions to address the trauma that had transformed his grief over Emma's death into a surveillance system designed to prevent future loss, slowly learning to recognize that his monitoring behavior was actually a monument to his own unprocessed fear rather than an effective strategy for keeping loved ones safe, gradually understanding that authentic protection meant teaching people to trust their own judgment rather than replacing their decision, making capacity with external oversight and behavioral modification. The therapy process had been excruciating for him, involving homework assignments where he had to practice tolerance for uncertainty about my well-being, structured exercises in respecting my privacy, even when his anxiety screamed that something terrible might be happening in the spaces between our scheduled communications. Gradual exposure to the reality that loving someone sometimes means allowing them to experience difficulties without immediately intervening to minimize their discomfort or solve their problems before they've had a chance to develop their own coping strategies. Our new communication protocol involved weekly phone calls scheduled at mutually convenient times, rather than his previous system of random check-ins designed to catch me in moments of vulnerability or poor decision-making, conversations where we discussed general well-being and shared experiences rather than detailed reports about my daily activities, sleep patterns, social interactions, or financial choices that had once been subject to his analysis and feedback. The hardest part for him was learning to ask open-ended questions that invited sharing rather than pointed inquiries designed to gather intelligence about potential risks or concerning behavioral changes, practicing phrases like, "How are you feeling about work these days?" instead of "What time did you go to bed last night? And did you remember to set your alarm properly?" which had been his default mode of expressing care through information gathering and problem anticipation. For my part, I was learning to distinguish between reasonable requests for connection and attempts to resume monitoring under the guise of normal family communication, developing the skills to share appropriately personal information without feeling like I was submitting to interrogation or providing data for analysis, by someone who might use my honesty against me during future discussions about my life choices and their potential consequences. The apartment visit represented a milestone in this delicate reconstruction process, with him managing to spend 3 hours in my space without offering unsolicited advice about security systems, without asking about my dating life beyond general questions about my happiness and social satisfaction, without commenting on the expired milk in my refrigerator or the fact that I'd apparently been eating cereal for dinner more often than he would consider nutritionally optimal for a woman my age. My mother watched this careful dance between us with the wonder of someone witnessing a miracle, having spent decades normalizing his controlling behavior and now seeing him struggle to express love through respect rather than management, concern through trust rather than verification, protection through empowerment rather than limitation of risk exposure and autonomous decision-making opportunities. The moment that crystallized our progress came when my smoke alarm started beeping due to a low battery, and instead of immediately taking charge of the situation with lectures about home maintenance and offers to install a smart system that would monitor my apartment's safety status remotely, he simply asked if I had replacement batteries and offered to help reach the high ceiling if I needed assistance, treating me like a competent adult who might appreciate support rather than a helpless child who required rescue from her own domestic inadequacies. Looking back now, 18 months after that first glimpse of red light in my bathroom mirror shattered my illusion of privacy and forced me to confront the difference between protection and possession, I've come to understand that my story isn't really about smart toothbrushes or hidden cameras, or even the specific pathology of a grieving parent who confused monitoring with meaningful connection. It's about the invisible chains that exist in all our relationships, the subtle ways we allow others to define our worth through their need to manage our choices, and the courage required to recognize when someone's version of caring has become indistinguishable from their need to maintain power over our autonomous existence. The red light that once symbolized violation now represents awakening, a moment of clarity that illuminated not just the cameras in my bathroom but the entire architecture of diminished expectations I'd built around myself, the careful way I'd learned to make myself smaller and more manageable in exchange for the illusion of being cherished by someone who confused ownership with affection, who mistook compliance for connection, who believed that genuine intimacy required comprehensive information rather than mutual respect and voluntary vulnerability. Every day in my small apartment, I practiced the radical act of existing without audience or approval, making decisions that range from mundane breakfast choices to significant career moves without consulting an invisible advisory board of people who might disapprove, might worry, might have opinions about the wisdom of my selections based on their own fears rather than my authentic needs and desires. The process of reclaiming my autonomy has taught me to recognize similar patterns everywhere, in marriages where partners track each other's every movement through location-sharing apps disguised as safety measures, in friendships where emotional manipulation masquerades as deep concern, in workplaces where micromanagement is presented as mentorship, in families where guilt becomes the primary currency of connection and privacy is treated as evidence of disloyalty rather than healthy psychological development. The most insidious aspect of these invisible chains is how willingly we often accept them, how easily we convince ourselves that someone's need to know everything about our lives is evidence of their superior capacity for devotion rather than their inability to tolerate the natural uncertainty that comes with respecting another person's right to exist beyond our sphere of influence and understanding. I've learned to ask different questions when someone's caring feels suffocating, not whether they mean well, because most people do, but whether their version of love requires me to sacrifice my dignity, my privacy, my right to make mistakes and learn from consequences without their intervention or commentary. There need to be constantly reassured about my well-being and decision-making capacity. The bathroom mirror in my apartment reflects only me now. No red lights or hidden monitoring systems. Just a woman who's learning to trust her own judgment about everything from dental hygiene to romantic partnerships to career choices. Someone who's discovered that self-worth isn't measured by how successfully you meet other people's expectations, but by how courageously you honor your own authentic needs, even when they disappoint or frighten the people who claim to have your best interests at heart. My relationship with my parents continues to evolve through the slow, imperfect process of establishing healthy boundaries that allow for connection without capitulation, affection without surveillance, concern without intrusion, proving that it's possible to reconstruct damaged relationships when both parties are willing to distinguish between loving someone and needing to manage them, between wanting the best for someone and insisting on defining what that means for their particular life circumstances. The wisdom I've gained from this experience extends far beyond family dynamics into every aspect of human connection, helping me recognize the difference between people who support my growth and people who need me to remain static for their own psychological comfort, between relationships that expand my sense of possibility and relationships that require me to diminish myself to maintain harmony, between authentic intimacy that honors autonomy and codependent attachment that masquerades as extraordinary devotion. The question that haunts me now isn't whether my story is unique. I know it isn't. But how many people are living with their own versions of invisible monitoring, accepting diminished autonomy as the price of being cared for, never questioning whether the people who claim to cherish them might actually be more invested in controlling them than in supporting their authentic development and self-determined happiness. If after hearing my story you feel there's someone in your life whose caring feels more like monitoring, whose protection feels more like prison, don't wait until you're 34 to start asking the hard questions about autonomy and dignity. Tell me in the comments, what invisible chains might you be carrying? What relationships in your life require you to sacrifice privacy for peace? And don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing where my audience of brave souls is located around the world. Sometimes the most loving thing someone can do is learn to care about us without needing to manage us. Don't forget to subscribe, because this journey of reclaiming autonomy has many more stories that will make you question everything about what healthy love actually looks like in practice.